It's my privilege to introduce Renn, who is a writer and consultant and author of the book Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. His writing appears in a number of leading global publications, including The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and others. He's a senior fellow at American Reformer, a former senior fellow in urban policy at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and a former managing director at Accenture. Today, his focus is on helping conservatives and the American church rise to the challenge of finding success in the 21st century. He lives with his wife and son in Indianapolis, Indiana, and made his way out here to join us. Please welcome Renn.
Thank you. In the talks I'm going to be giving here this year, I'm kind of going to be previewing some material from my new album, if you will. This is sort of some new material, new topic that I've been spending a lot on, talking about leadership in America and in the church. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership decline in America and what's caused that. And then tomorrow, I want to talk about how evangelicals could become leaders in our society and more effective ones. So my guess is that most of you do not believe that we have great leadership in America right now. That is not a veiled reference to any particular person, but I think the belief that we have a leadership deficit is just widely shared in our society. I think we see it in the long-term decline in trusted institutions, for example. And I want to explore some of the reasons behind this leadership decline. I'm going to hit three. One is the decline of Christianity. The second is the fall of the old WASP establishment. And the third is sort of corporate consolidations, if you will. So the first reason is the decline of Christianity. And I don't want to make too much out of this, but it does play a role in my view. And those of you who are familiar with my work or maybe saw me a few years ago when I spoke here, you might be familiar with my sort of model of secularization. But for those who may not be, I'll give a very quick overview of it. Unlike Europe, America never had a state church. But for most of our history, we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism, which after World War II morphed into a generic Judeo-Christianity as our default national religion. So as recently as the 1950s, half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. That's the kind of country we had. This system began to become unraveled in the 1960s, and Christianity went into decline in America. Decline in church attendance, decline in personal adherence, and decline in belief in the Christian moral system. And we can divide this period of decline from 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, neutral world, negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. In the positive world, Christianity is in decline, but yet is still basically viewed positively. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society, and Christian morality is still the basic moral norms of the country. 1994, we hit a tipping point and entered the neutral world, which lasts from 1994 to 2014. And in the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian morality had a certain residual hold on society. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point, and for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. Maybe that would be a better way to put it. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society, quite the opposite, in fact. And Christian morality, in many ways, is now expressly repudiated and even viewed as a threat to the new public moral order. And this shift into a negative world has been very unsettling for American Christians who've been used to thinking of themselves as a moral majority. for those of you who remember the name of Jerry Falwell's old organization. And when I talk about this model, I think the first thing that Christians tend to do is say, well, how does this affect us? How does this affect the church? And of course, that's a logical thing to think about. But I want to talk a bit about how this shift has affected the culture as large, because the advent of the negative world has had profound and pervasive effects on the culture at large. Think about, for example, the legalization and social normalization of gambling, something that 30 years ago would have been seen as a seedy, mobbed-up activity. Or look at the movement towards pot legalization and legalization of other drugs. Again, not just legalizing it, but it's sort of socially accepted today. Of course, the continued long march of the sexual revolution remains in play as well. And these changes have definitely affected the character of our national leadership, because personal character is no longer a criterion that people use in determining who to vote for, who to put in various positions, etc. In fact, when I talk about the three worlds, it seems a little abstract, and I like to try to make it concrete for people and help people to really kind of maybe bring it to life and understand it by actually using the example of three different presidential sex scandals. So in the positive world, you go back to 1987, which is fairly late into the positive world. Colorado Senator Gary Hart is the leading contender to be the Democratic nominee for president the next year, when it was reported that he had had a young woman stay overnight in his Washington townhouse. And the furor over this, the scandal, forced him to have to drop out of the race. You know, as recently as the 1980s, an allegation of an affair could be a career ender for a politician. The neutral world, fast forward to 1998, the Drudge Report breaks the story that President Bill Clinton has been having an affair with a White House intern. Now, this scandal very badly damaged Clinton. Make no mistake about it, it's probably why Bush won in 2000, and yet he survived it, as Democrats and even feminists closed ranks behind him and said, however deplorable his personal behavior may be, it's not relevant to his performance in public office. The negative world, fast forward to October 2016. NBC News has a tape of Donald Trump on the set of Access Hollywood saying all sorts of crude things about women. Now, they've had this tape for months, and they've been sitting on it, waiting to drop it on Trump as an October surprise, thinking they'll knock him out of the race. But in retrospect, that was about a 48-hour blip of a scandal. He went on to win election shortly thereafter. It had no impact. And it does seem that today, the character standards for holding elective office or some other leadership have really never been lower. Unless you commit an actual crime or some type of DEI violation, it just doesn't matter to people. And I think the reality is that a post-Christian America really no longer cares about things like that. I think maybe we're all too busy, placing our parlay bets on the big game while smoking pot or something like that. And that's just reality. And I think it's, again, I think American evangelicals tried to kind of fight a rear guard action in the Clinton impeachment over this. But, now we're in this world where, like, the candidates we're going to have to vote for are probably not, maybe not any of them, are going to measure up to what we might want. So the decline of America, I think, has undermined kind of the moral dimension of national leadership. And a second factor is the collapse of the old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or WASP establishment. Again, unlike Europe, we never had a titled aristocracy, but for a long time we had a sort of unofficial aristocracy in the form of a semi-hereditary upper class known as the WASPs. Now, in the original sense of the term WASP, that specifically referred to the upper class. Not everyone who was white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant was considered a WASP. So George Herbert Walker Bush, good waspy name, was a WASP because he was from a patrician family in Connecticut, whereas Jimmy Carter, the Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher and peanut farmer, was not a WASP. He did not come from a blue blood background. The most important scholar of the WASP establishment was the late sociologist E. Digby Baltzell. In fact, he's the reason anybody's ever heard of this term. He popularized it in his 1964 book, The Protestant Establishment. And the WASPs, as sort of Baltzell was the first to complain, had a lot of defects. He noticed that in a very kind of diverse post-Ellis Island America, they functioned as a sort of caste who refused to admit new men of merit to their ranks who were Catholic or Jewish. You know, they might be blackballed from a country club or from certain other organizations. For example, there's a quip, kind of an apocryphal quip, probably attributed to Barry Goldwater, who was half Jewish but actually raised Episcopalian. Barry Goldwater was actually an Episcopalian. And he wanted to join the country club, and he said, since I'm only half Jewish, can I join if I only play 9 holes? And the answer was no, they wouldn't let him. And also, too many WASPs were actually not stepping up and taking positions in leadership in society that had sort of justified their position, and instead they were just kind of enjoying themselves, throwing great parties in their exclusive resorts and the like. They were enjoying their privileges without contributing back to society. And not long after America elected its first Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, in 1960, the WASP establishment essentially disintegrated. In fact, they became something of a joke. If any of you are old enough to remember the old TV show Gilligan's Island, you can think of Thurston Howell III as sort of a character of this type who's being mocked. Now, this certainly provided for a more open society, which was benefited Indiana farm boys of Catholic peasant origins, such as myself. But at the same time, while America's new leadership may not have some of the defects of the old WASP, it has none of their virtues. And one of the things that Baltzell does so well is to explain what an establishment is and actually why it's a good thing and even important. We toss around the term establishment a lot, and we never really define what it is, and it's always considered a bad thing, right? We gotta overthrow the GOP establishment or something like that. Well, Baltzell actually defines what he means by the term. He says, you have an establishment when a critical mass of the senior-most positions in the key domains of societies, you might think senators, major corporate CEOs, foundation or university presidents, those sorts of things, he called these the elite positions, are occupied by members of the upper class. And when you have this establishment, when the sort of upper class sort of dominates the life of the country in that way, then that means that the social norms and the codes of conduct of the upper class become normative in society. Their sort of ways of life become the ways of life, everyone follow along with them. So I'll just give one real life example. Think about the code of the gentleman. One of the things conservatives love to do is bemoan the fact that men no longer behave like gentlemen. But the code of the gentleman, as we understand it, came from that Anglo-American upper class. And when this class formed an establishment, when they were dominant in society, men aspired to be gentlemen, or at least knew that they should aspire to be gentlemen, right? They followed the lead of the upper class establishment. But in the absence of the class that defined what it meant to be a gentleman, it's no surprise people don't behave like gentlemen anymore. And in fact, being a gentleman is actually held in contempt. So George H.W. Bush was the consummate gentleman. But look at how he was treated. People mocked him. They said he was a wimp. for example. Now, of course, he had been shot down in his plane. He was a pilot in World War II, was shot down over the Pacific. That doesn't sound like being a wimp. He was a star athlete in college. That doesn't sound like he's a wimp. He was the head of the CIA. That does not sound like a wimp. He probably did some things you might want to talk about here. But like that stuff didn't count. It's like he was just a fossil. He was a relic. And no surprise, people today behave by a very different ethic. And one of the things, there's a lot about that upper class code of conduct, but one I really want to hone in on is that they had a genuine ethos of public service that went beyond, mere personal advantage or selfish interest or kind of, sordid gain, you might say. And I just want to give one example of someone here because it's almost like we can't even relate to this person. And that's a guy by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. He was actually the grandson of Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr., and he was also a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. And when World War II started, he was in the Senate, and he decided to resign from the Senate in order to go fight in the war. Like that right there. How many U.S. senators are going to resign their Senate seat to go fight in a war today? Particularly if you came from one of America's most prestigious families, the Cabots and the Lodges being the two most prominent families in Boston. And he went on to serve presidents of multiple parties through the 1970s. And he once said, quote, "Service in any situation, foreign or domestic, which acutely involves American security must always be considered from a totally unpartisan viewpoint, without regard to party politics, important though party politics are." And when John F. Kennedy appointed him the ambassador to South Vietnam, he told Kennedy, "I want you to know that if it will serve the United States, I am expendable. Just don't do it for unimportant reasons." And Kennedy essentially took him up on the offer because Henry Cabot Lodge got blamed for the coup that overthrew South Vietnamese President Diem, even though Cabot Lodge was acting on Kennedy's orders. A fact that only came out within the last 5 to 7 years that Kennedy had essentially ordered him to overthrow Diem, but he never defended his own reputation. He never said anything about that. He just kind of went on doing his thing. And then as he went through the various positions that he held, and he came to kind of like to be late in life, not only had he not gotten rich, he had to start selling off family artworks to stay afloat financially because he'd so neglected his own finances in serving the country. And we can't even relate to something like that today. It's inconceivable that anyone would go into government after all these years and come out so much poorer than they went in. But he was hardly the only one. There's a guy by the name of John Lindsay. Some of you may know. He was a congressman and later was mayor of New York City in the 1960s. He wasn't a particularly good mayor. He was infamous for, not getting the snow plowed in one of these blizzards. But there were no good mayors in the late 60s. It was a rough time for American cities. But the point is, he's another guy. After all this public service, he essentially went broke. I don't know if he technically actually went bankrupt, but in the 90s, I believe Rudy Giuliani, when he was mayor, had to actually hire John Lindsay with the city in order for him to get health insurance and a pension because he had no money. Again, these guys put themselves into poverty, essentially, through public service. Now, not everybody was that extreme, but it was certainly a far cry from anything we have today. And so that ethos of public service, among many other great qualities that many of the WASP leaders brought, is something that is essentially completely missing from our society today. So the loss of that establishment in the norms of the upper class are a big problem. And the third factor in America's leadership decline has been industrial consolidation that created much more nationalization and globalization of business. And This has particularly affected the banking, utility, and retail sectors at the local level. And this is one, the first two you can say had a more of a national effect, local effect, but also a national effect. This is one that had a little more of a local effect. Up until 1980, interstate bank mergers in America were essentially banned. And even within states, banks were typically very heavily restricted in terms of where they could open branches. It would not be uncommon, for example, for there to be a law that says a bank can only open branches in the county where it is based. There were some states they're called unit banking states that banks weren't allowed to have any branches. They could essentially only have one office. And the net result is that every city in America was basically dominated by hometown banks. So I grew up near Louisville, Kentucky, and the three big banks there were First National, Citizens Fidelity, and Liberty National, which of course have now all been swallowed up. And the leaders of these banks were very important civic leaders. In fact, the president of the biggest bank in town may well have been the most powerful person in the city. And maybe the best example of this, although I admit it's a negative example, but maybe the best one I can think of is Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. Think about how he dominates the civic life of Bedford Falls. And by the way, who is the only person in town who can stand up to Mr. Potter? It's George Bailey, who is also a banker. Think it's about that. Now, through the 80s and 90s, these bank presidents had personal and professional interests that were very aligned with that of their community. So I'm the president of the bank and I want my pay to go up. Well, if I want my pay to go up, I guess the profits of the bank need to go up. Well, how do the profits of the bank go up? I need to make more loans. Well, how do I make more loans? Well, when you can only do business in your own town, you really need your town to prosper and get bigger and have more people and more business. There's more loans. So the CEO's paycheck and the prosperity of the community were very tightly linked. Now, once you get into the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was a massive deregulation of the banking sector. This saw huge amounts of consolidation. So almost all of these banks were bought out by what turned into a handful of national banking giants like Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase. And the person who is the quote unquote president, let's say, of the Portland market of one of these banks is really just a middle manager in his own company. In fact, increasingly the person who holds that job, that's kind of like a side gig, kind of a community relations side gig. The person's real job in the bank is actually something else. And that person probably isn't going to be around for the long term because if they're actually any good, they're going to get a promotion in a bigger city or a bigger opportunity somewhere else. And while they're here and they're sitting on the Chamber of Commerce boards and doing all that stuff, they're going to be very timid and very risk averse because they don't want to do anything that might get them in trouble at the bank in their career because they're not really in charge of anything. And so you have completely disempowered, much more transient, much more timid leaders in these institutions today. And so that's just a complete sea change before. And so it's not just banking. The Public Utilities Holding Company Act used to basically make utility mergers illegal. So you mentioned I live in Indianapolis. In Indianapolis, our electric utility, Indianapolis Power and Light, it served basically the city of Indianapolis. It's the same thing. If you want to make more money, you have to sell electricity. Indianapolis has to get bigger. Well, now that all these laws that ban mergers have been repealed, IPL is like a minor unit inside of a giant company called AES, which, according to the newspapers, is about to be taken over by BlackRock. And the same thing with retail. The department stores are gone, the local drugstore chains are gone, et cetera. So there's been this like massive decline in the caliber of corporate leadership in cities, which is just one of the things that has contributed to why they can't seem to solve any problems. You've got a bunch of essentially middle managers who sit on these committees and they don't really ever do anything. And I think the WASP establishment issue also affects cities. because increasingly the current generations of these old money families in these cities have moved away to places like San Francisco and New York. Eli Lilly, the most valuable pharmaceutical company in the world because of their weight loss drugs, based in Indianapolis. I don't think a single member of the Lilly family lives in Indianapolis today. There's this new mayor in San Francisco who's apparently, done a decent job so far, maybe starting to turn things around there. He's an heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, but luckily for him, for them, he didn't need to leave to move to San Francisco because he was already from there. So he got to stay where he was. And so I think this is an example of, again, why it seems like leaders in a lot of the places where we live can't really do a whole lot when it comes to problems. And so I think there are a lot of things we could talk about as contributing to poor leadership in America. But I think these are three that have really, to me, had very specific negative effects. So we've got this decline of Christianity, which has led to essentially a complete evisceration of any moral and character standards. We had the decline of the WASP establishment, the fall of the WASP establishment, which led to this elimination of this ethos of public service and other qualities that often been dominant in our leadership, and also corporate consolidation, which essentially hollowed out leadership at the state and local level. So the question is, what can we do about this situation? And tomorrow is when I'm going to talk about evangelicals specifically and what we can start doing about it. But I want to give just a few, maybe a few little ideas and one challenge to you before I wrap up. I think one thing that we can do today, and is obviously an imperative, is intentional character formation in our children. So when we were in a positive world environment, when we were in the era of the establishment, the cultural environment of America encouraged people to be people of good character, or to at least try to fake it, because there were rewards for doing so. And more importantly, maybe there were punishments if you weren't that. Well, today, virtue, character have to be developed through a highly intentional process. People are not just gonna pick this stuff up through cultural osmosis. And so I think Christian parenting, Christian schooling, play a key role in this formation of men and women to act and operate with high character and virtue in our society. Not because they're gonna get rewards for doing it or punishments for not doing it, but because that's who they are as people, and because they are seeking to please the God who enlisted them, as Paul wrote to Timothy. And I think if we look at the biblical qualifications for leadership in the church, for eldership, we see that it is dominated by questions of character. Being above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, free from the love of money. Things of that nature are critical. Now, good personal character does not guarantee that you will be a good leader, but it is very hard to be a good leader without having good character. And I think the Bible, the Christian tradition, and the classical sources are always what we in the West have looked to define character and virtue. Beyond that, I think that the next generation and us, ourselves as well, need to come to see that it is part of the creation mandate for us to lead. And I mean to truly lead in society. Christians are called to be more than salt and light in the world, although of course we're called to be that. We are called to restructure the world, and I will have much, much more to say about that tomorrow. But unless we see that as our mission, we're always gonna kind of take the contours of the world as we receive it as a given. We're not going to challenge the status quo in a fundamental way. Now, this sort of leadership that I'm talking about here requires a lot of wisdom, especially if you're a Christian. Now, I do think that overt hostility to Christianity has sort of receded in the last year or two, But I think if we all got together and decided to start legislating morality, if you will, we would get some massive blowback on that. And so we see, for example, when it comes to abortion, every time abortion has been on the ballot since Roe versus Wade was repealed, the pro-abortion side has won a majority of the vote. So that's like a cultural reality that we have to think about. Well, what do you do? What do you do then? And, we have to start with the reality of where society is today, just like the early church had to start with the reality of Rome. And changing the culture is a long-term project. It took hundreds of years to transform Rome. And many of the problems that we face today are complex and do not have obvious or trivial solutions. I can think about high housing prices, income inequality, declining trust in institutions. These aren't easy to fix. There's no silver bullet. And if anybody claims they got a silver bullet, be skeptical. It might be a good idea, but there's probably a lot more going on. And then you add to that everybody hates change, right? So even no matter how bad things are, a good chunk of the people are going to hate anything you want to try to do to fix it. And then, again, the nature of authority today is so sort of diffuse and undefined, it can even be hard to know what to do to go about making anything good happen. I think about this, if I were elected to Congress, and I showed up at Congress next year, I'd be like, how would I go about making that a functional institution? I have no idea. It's not obvious what you would do there. So the world is complex, and we have to have, not just the character in these things, but we do have to have, a lot of wisdom and savvy in dealing with it. But I think we very much need to engage on it. And I'll give one charge, if you will, one piece of encouragement in kind of conclusion, which is do not just be someone who goes along to get along. When I was focused on urban policy work, it was sort of my previous life, if you will, I'd go to all these conferences. And I was always struck that every single speaker, and it even seemed like every single person in the audience, basically all believed the exact same things. It was like, wow, am I in North Korea or is she China? There's almost no dissent here. And, I think that kind of groupthink is present in way too many domains in our society. And you've probably experienced it in your lives here as well. And this is not healthy because we don't have robust debate and disagreement with a genuine variety of perspectives. We all too often are going to fail to fix the problems or seize the opportunities. And I don't know, it's a long way away. I don't know how many of you all have ever been to Chicago. I lived in Chicago for 20 years, so I know it well. But if you ever go to Chicago, one thing you'll notice is it's on Lake Michigan, and virtually the entire lakefront of Chicago is parkland. It's open parkland. And you're like, well, you go to New York City, it's elevated highways. So you're like, well, what happened? And basically the reason for that is 100 years ago, Aaron Montgomery Ward, the department store king, went to the mat to stop people from building in Grant Park downtown. And he wore out his welcome among his peers by filing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit against it until eventually the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that Grant Park had to remain forever free and clear of buildings. And if this one rich guy hadn't stood up and said, I'll be the bad guy, who knows what might have happened. And I think we need people who will, on occasion, be the person who simply refuses to go along with the crowd but stands up for a better way. Now, we can't do that all the time. Let me be clear. We do have to maintain relationships. We do have to steward our influence. There are some people who, frankly, probably wade into too many disputes. They need to come out. Maybe they need to cut back on some of the Twitter wars. But, right, the reason to steward your influence is so that you can actually use it at some point. And all too few people today are willing to do that. At some point, every one of us needs to be willing to make the decisions to make ourselves unpopular, to stand up for what is right or what goes against the consensus position. And that's a big part of what it means to be a leader. Now, that's not the only thing it'll take to revive leadership. Again, no silver bullets. I'll talk about a lot more practical ideas tomorrow, but it has to be part of the solution, I think, because perhaps the greatest of the cardinal virtues is courage, because it's the one thing you can't fake. Thank you.